and answer session. Just to confirm that the event is to run from 7 p.m. to 8:15 p.m, with the presentation taking us to approximately 7:45 and then having 30 minutes of questions. Just in terms of some general housekeeping, everyone will be muted during the course of the presentation, and the presentation is being recorded. At the end of the presentation, if anyone has any planning related questions, please can you type these in the chat section, select the to everyone function and confirm your name and address. I'll then take those questions and direct them to the relevant members of the team. Following this presentation, there will be an opportunity to view details of the proposals on the project website. This is www.cuerdenhall.com, and questions can also be directed to the following email address: inquiries@cuerdenhall.com. Okay then, without further ado, I will pass you over to Colin Shenton, who will explain his aspirations for the site.
Thanks, Tom, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the planning consultation. I'm delighted to see so many people. I think we've got about 70 joining us all together. I think what you're about to see is truly exceptional. Cuerden Hall returned to its original use and preserved for the next 100 years. It's a rare event when so many great country houses become wedding venues, conference centres or institutions. Cuerden will make an amazing family home, but I think it's much more than that. It holds an affectionate place in the hearts of local people and the former staff and patients of the care home. It has a fascinating social and architectural history, and the more research we do, the more important we find it to be, and so the more it deserves the thorough restoration we're going to carry out. Interestingly, in its 300-year history, it's never been open to the public, and so beyond this consultation, the wealth of information at cuerdenhall.com and the planning process itself, we'll arrange open days, COVID precautions allowing, before and during the works, so that everyone can see the starting point and the progress and maybe get involved as well. So before you hear from our historian, landscape experts and architects, I'd first of all just like to thank a few people, particularly Sue Ryder Care for preserving the building. All of the fireplaces, the ceilings, carvings, staircases and ornamentation are still in the house. And so many great houses are stripped of everything valuable. And this enables us to restore everything authentically. I'd like to thank Historic England for their guidance and support, and to Purcell and to Tom Stuart-Smith, whom you'll hear from in a moment, who are both world-leading experts in their fields, and both have painstakingly researched and designed this restoration programme, which preserves and enhances the house and its setting, far beyond anything that I originally thought possible when I first saw the house. And finally, I'm very pleased that we're joined this evening by Marcus Binney, the eminent architectural historian, the saviour of many a fine house, who has kindly agreed to write the definitive history of the hall and its restoration. And finally, also John Martin Robinson from Country Life, himself born in Preston and who gained a doctorate on Samuel Wyatt, so I'm expecting the tough questions to come from him. I'll hand you back to our heritage planning consultant, Tom Flanagan, and look forward to your questions later. Tom.
That's great, thanks Colin. Just a little bit on the planning process. The team have been keen to consult with the key parties from the outset. They've therefore entered into a formal pre-application process with Chorley Council, and we've got the support of their planning and conservation officers to the scheme. We've had positive pre-app discussions with Historic England and the Georgian Society, and we've also been open from the outset with the public on the proposals. In our view, this consultation has been critical to developing the proposals and progressing them through the planning system. I will now hand you over to the design team. They include Rebecca Burrows of Purcell, who will explain the history, the development and significance of the site and buildings. Tom Stuart-Smith, who will take us through the landscaping proposals, and Tom Brigden, again of Purcell, who will explain the design proposals and the architecture. Okay, I'll hand you over, Rebecca.
Right, hello everyone. So I am just going to talk briefly about the heritage-led approach that we took towards the development of the architecture and the landscape proposals at Cuerden Hall. And I'm going to be able to offer a very brief overview of the findings of the conservation plan and the historic research. And I apologize for it being extremely brief, but we have the extended history document on the Cuerden Hall website already, and there will be additions to that in form of the full CMP, the conservation plan, at the end of this week. So just to start off with, I want to say that our approach has been following the guidance set out by Historic England and national policy. And really it's about how we can approach a building using an informed understanding of its significance to inform change, and significance is what is special about that building. So we understand, we unpick the site, go around and understand the history through primary research and talking to people who have lived there and been there in the past. And we use that to articulate what is special about the place. And then from there, we can understand the impact of the proposal. So that's sort of the process that we go through. So very quickly, where I began with my research was into the early history of Cuerden Hall and what was there before. The hall and the manor itself goes back to at least the 11th century, but we know there's evidence of Roman activity on the site as well, as potentially along the cinder track, or potentially a bit further to the north. But we've got a lot of excellent, interesting maps. So this is a 1598 map, and there's also probate inventories of John Cuerden and lots of other sources that informed our understanding. It's been really interesting looking into the local families that have owned the hall. We've got the Molyneux, the Woodcocks, the Bannisters, the Charnocks, the Fleetwoods, the Parkers, the Townleys, the Tattons, a lot of local families, and you can still see the names of their homes in the surrounding villages as well. And that 1717 house you've got there was Bannister Parkers. And that's the one that is at the core of the existing building now. Then about 100 years later, we get Bannister Parker's grandson, Robert Townley Parker, and he commissioned Lewis Wyatt of the famous Wyatt dynasty to rebuild a much grander house on the site, reusing the existing house. And it's really interesting, particularly to have found all of Wyatt's original letters and drawings to Robert Townley Parker, which are in the Lancashire archives, and in the originals are in the Canadian Architectural Centre, which was interesting tracking those down. They're amazing evidence for what we've got in the building, but also what has been lost. So things like decorative plasterwork and the conservatory and paneling and some fireplaces. So the ability to potentially reproduce and restore those features based on evidence is really very exciting for us. And then you sort of get to the 20th century history of the site, and then it sort of goes a little bit downhill from there. In terms of the uses were no longer a single family use, but you had institutional and municipal uses, which has somewhat eroded the history, the historic features that survive in the building. So it was requisitioned by the War Department and used as a hospital for wounded soldiers, which there's a lot of interesting social history surrounding that. By the 70s, it had been sold as the offices for the Central Lancashire Development Corporation. And in 1986, the site became a Sue Ryder care home, which continued until its closure in 2019. So there's actually a lot of people that still have memories around the care home, and I'm sure there are some people on this call today, and they've been in touch with us as well, which really does add to our understanding of the social value, and it's really very interesting. Very quickly here, we've got an example of the sort of, that's actually hundreds and hundreds of pages of historic letters, documents, and primary sources that we've been able to find, which have really helped our understanding of the site. And from there, we then are able to articulate that thing that is very special about Cuerden Hall and why it's grade 2 star. And a lot of it is around the history, the surviving fabric, and intangible qualities as well. So architecturally, it illustrates that transition from the formal 18th century house through to the 19th century, more informal, picturesque, walking out into your garden sort of building and how it was used. We've got plan form that still survives, internal features, and obviously the external appearance as well, all add to this. It's a lot of good intact plan form that's really interesting. In terms of historic interest, associations with the Wyatt family, as well as the local families as well, and all the people that have memories of this building, as well as the landscapes as well. And that's also part of the shift between the picturesque and the garden-esque style. And here this is how we've been articulating significance, which will be shown in the conservation plan and on the planning portal. So don't worry about understanding it as it shows now, but basically from sort of left to right, you have the very high significant area of the Wyatt wing. You get to then the 1717 house in the centre that's red, and that is of high significance because there is quite a bit more detrimental sort of more modifications in that area. Again, towards the right, you've got the service wing, which again, lots of internal alterations and external modern extensions that are detrimental to significance. And then over to the right, you have the stable wing, which in terms of exterior is very important, but interiors, well, there's a lot of fire damage and a lot of disused spaces that have really suffered from that lack of maintenance. And I just want to mention here that it's important to remember that we want Cuerden Hall to remain viable for the future. So listed buildings need to be able to adapt to sort of new uses and how they can be used in the future. And that's why those significant plans are really helpful, because they show, as well as areas of sensitivity, but also areas where it's possible to carry out additional changes in an appropriate way, of course. So things that are going to be positive, we've got lots of public benefits about how we can change, improve and enhance. So if we go around these really quickly clockwise, you've got removal of inappropriate internal fixtures and fittings. And here you've got the sink. I think this was an activity room. Removal of hard standing in the north courtyard, reinstatement of fire damaged buildings, introduction of high quality new spaces such as a conservatory, which Wyatt had shown on his drawings, restoration of interiors. I think you've got 18th century paneling there, which has been painted a lovely shade of pink. And of course, conservation repairs to historic fabric that might not have had much done to it in quite a long time. Again, don't worry about reading this. So this is the table of impact for every single proposal that is included in the planning application, and that will be online as well. It's just an example to show how we've made that assessment. So it's important as part of this to be able to articulate where harm is so that we can seek to avoid it, minimize it and mitigate it as well. So we're looking at, I think from planning's perspective, you've got loss of small areas of historic fabric for services, as well as new door openings. But that does have a fairly limited impact on what makes that house special. Guest accommodation, that will be a big change, but again, those interiors are in a very poor condition, so it'll be overall an improvement. And as well, we've got this swimming pool would be a major intervention, but we do not consider that that strikes at the heart of what makes Cuerden a special place. It's located in the service courtyard, limited impact on historic fabric, and lots of detrimental changes occurred in that location. So I just want to end here then, and just hope that that introduction about the heritage-led approach has been useful. And again, if you want to know more about the history of the site, then it's all on the website as a an online sort of PDF that you can look at. So I'm going to hand over now to Tom Stuart-Smith, who's a landscape architect and garden designer, and he's working on the project, but I think he's also working on the new RHS site at Bridgewater, which sounds really interesting as well. So I'll hand over to him now.
Great, thank you, Becky. Yes, I've been doing the master plan for RHS Bridgewater, and this in its way is every bit as exciting, because the landscape, I would say almost more than anything, is going to transform the way that this building is appreciated. Because what obviously has happened here is that the whole landscape context has disappeared. This was originally a family house. It's going to be a family house again, but it's lost everything that makes the setting of it appropriate as a family house. It's lost the wall garden, and it's lost the park, and it's lost half of its, or much more than half of its original sort of pleasure ground, the area of garden immediately around the house. And in rethinking how the landscape could be, we've really had to bear that in mind and think about how we can create a convincingly grand setting for this house in a much, much smaller space. So if we can go to the first slide. So this is our landscape master plan of the site. One of the things you'll notice immediately is there's a lot less tarmac around. So, and that brings home the point that this is a domestic family house. It's not it's not for commercial use. There are going to be a number of people that staying here or occupying flats in the stable yard. So there's a need for, you know, a respectable amount of car parking spaces, and those are going to be largely hidden away in the existing shrubbery to the north of the stable block, and a small amount to the west of the stable block. The drive itself is going to come through a pair of lodges, which Tom will show you in time, and there'll be a lot of effort to change that drive from one being overrun with Ponticum rhododendron, the wild rhododendron, to being a bit more grassy and less an approach to an abandoned house, more approach to a cared for home. One of the other things you'll see on the approach to the house is that we're going to restore the little, it was actually built as a reservoir, but it's like an ornamental lake to the north of the house, which might have a little tea house on an island there. That was a fairly short-lived feature of the garden, because it's on, seems to be on quite porous soil, but we reline it either with clay or with an artificial liner and get that feature back. Then there's the area around the house where we're going to bring back a limited amount of car parking in front of the house and restore the stonework of the balustrades, which create part of the formal setting for Lewis Wyatt's house. We'll be reducing the amount of planting against the house on the north side of the sort of ancillary wing of the 17th century house, and the area between that and the stables, because that's all got rather sort of overgrown and tatty. And the same really applies to the south side of the house, where lots of sort of dwarf conifers and other planting have grown up over the years. So the landscape that we're going to be putting back around Cuerden Hall is doesn't really bear much resemblance to anything that's been there before. It's much more formal and structured. And this really reflects the way that the garden has become much smaller. And if we were to be more historically accurate, really, we would just have, you know, half a dozen trees on the lawn and then some planting around the house, and that would be it. And that wouldn't create the kind of spaces which Colin and Gareth are looking for. So this, in fact, was an early sketch, but where we are at the moment is not that different from it. You can see there's a vista, a main vista laid out to the south of the house, which going down to the existing plantation, and then gardens laid out on either side. A rose garden, a little orchard on the right-hand side between that main vista I was mentioning and the park, but with a terrace walk, so that you're walking along on top of the existing ha-ha, which would be restored, looking with views out into Cuerden Valley Park. And then on the other side, the bit closest to the house is now developed into a croquet lawn. And then we're going to build a proper functioning vegetable garden. So this is a garden for, you know, to produce, not only just to be beautiful, but to be productive as well. So we're going to, you can see a little square greenhouse. Again, that's changed slightly in the position, but the principle has stayed the same. So if we go on to some of the other images, this is again an early sketch of proposals around the house. Much more planting than is there at the moment, but a bit more organized, less you know, wild willows growing out of the walls virtually, and much more ornamental horticulture. The terraces are kept clear, but have formal planting growing in them, maybe in Case Versailles, or those on the left-hand side are Irish yews growing straight out of the terrace. And then you can see the distinction between the maybe more grand, perhaps more formal rhetorical character of the planting around the house and the slightly more intimate area of planting around the 17th century house. And that reflects the difference in use between the two parts of the house, the one being more formal and for events and parties and all that sort of thing, and the other being the more private part of the house. If we have the next image. So this is an image of the sort of character we would like to achieve coming up the drive. This is a garden we've worked on elsewhere. So still keeping the character of rhododendrons, azaleas, large trees, quite simple, but more cared for than the existing arrangement. Next one. And this is a sketch looking towards the house, a sort of little aerial sketch, showing the idea of new trees, much less tarmac around generally, more concentration of ornamental planting around the house as you approach it. A typical example of the kind of character that might have of some of the ornamental planting, so much more order than it is at the moment. Maybe the meadows on either side of the drive could have a little bit of that character you're seeing in the bottom right-hand corner, introducing some more ornamental flowering trees, but keeping the large structural trees, the oaks, the limes, the chestnuts, that sort of thing. So this is a view of the main vista looking back at the hall, framing that impressive south front in quite a formal way with these other gardens off to one side. And this is an example of something where something quite similar was done. This is a photo taken of Newby Hall in Yorkshire, which did have an informal pleasure ground coming up to the house until the late 19th century. And then these formal borders were introduced, I think, late 19th century, early 20th century, with more sort of garden-esque planting either side. I wouldn't say we're going to be doing the sort of massive planting of conifers and purple cherries that you see here off to the side, but the principle of the strong central vista anchored on the facade is very much where we're looking. This is a little sketch looking from the more private part of the house. You know, there's a supper table out with some planting in pots looking back towards the main part of the house. And some images of the kind of character we might be looking at. From the left-hand one is actually not a project of ours, but the other ones are, giving the idea of the mixture of the romantic and the formal, which we think is appropriate for Cuerden. And we're going to plant a beautiful rose garden that's in the top right-hand corner of the illustration you see in the top right of the picture. So that there's a real flamboyance to the garden. It's not just a polite bit of planting, all reserved, and it's going to have some serious chutzpah to it, I think. So, I mean, Colin and Gareth have both said, you know, that they would want occasionally to open the garden to the public, and that's something which I think will mean that it's kept to a really high standard, and I think that we should all welcome that. It makes it all the more exciting for all of us. Just more pictures of sort of showing the kind of themes that we might introduce into the garden. This is actually on the left. Some of you may recognise it's the spring walk, the nuttery at Sissinghurst, and we're going to have a spring walk leading from the more private part of the garden. You can see there in the top right-hand picture. And we're going to use both very formally clipped hedges and less formally clipped hedges, like this one in the bottom right. And then this is a photograph of the kind of orchard planting we might use in the bottom right of the pleasure ground, with some sort of arbor, probably a rose-covered arbor in the corner with views out into the park. And last of all, I mean, actually, this is a slightly bigger vegetable garden, isn't it, than the one we're going to have at Cuerden, but it shows you the kind of principle of a garden that would be both productive with cut flowers for the house and with vegetables. So the idea that I hope you'll take away from this is that it's going to be a very cared for garden. It's going to have, you know, a few people looking after it. It's going to be quite flamboyant and structured, with places for different things: vegetable gardens, cutting gardens, croquet lawn, as you can see in the top right there, woodland walks. It's going to have a bit of everything, really, packed into something which must be about, you know, 5% of the space that the original estate had. So it's going to be pretty exciting, and we're really looking forward to it. Thank you. I think that's our presentation over. So architecture.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself there. Hi, everybody. My name is Tom Stuart-Smith. I work for Purcell Architects alongside Becky. If I don't know if people are familiar with our practice, but we are a specialist conservation architecture practice based in Manchester. And we're currently working on the restoration of Manchester Town Hall. And probably the most well-known thing that we've recently done is the conservation of Big Ben and the restoration of the clock face there. So we, as a practice, begin any project with a historic building, really working to understand the building and its historical development and significance as the first part of what we need to do. And we believe that the success of any project involving a historic building really begins with that understanding of significance and therefore the capacity of change. So those areas of higher significance have capacity for very little change, whereas those areas of lower significance can accommodate greater change. And we recognise that change is important to historic buildings. It enables them to continue to have a viable use and ensures their long-term future. And in this, we're guided by the best practice guidance of Historic England and other groups. Max, I can't seem to, oh yes, I can, sorry, I can. So just to summarise what Becky was saying earlier, the house obviously developed in a number of stages, beginning with the 1717 house at the centre of the plan. And Lewis Wyatt then added the extension to the east side in about 1818. And so in terms of significance, we believe that the highest significant spaces are the Lewis Wyatt wing. This is where the best interiors survive and they're the most intact. The 1717 house, although older, has been heavily altered during the building's use by the MOD and later as a care home, and therefore it's got reduced significance in that section of the building. Although still high, there are some areas even of detrimental change where alterations have taken place. Moving on to the service wing, as Becky said, we've got a number of newer extensions within the courtyard, which we believe are detrimental to the heritage significance of this part of the building. And those areas of highest significance are parts of Lewis Wyatt's original service yard. But that service yard was encased with a corridor internally to the courtyard with a number of extensions and also a first floor, which all of which have detrimentally impacted the significance of that part of the building. And then subsequently in its use as a care home, and prior to that, it suffered from a number of alterations within that part of the building as well. Then moving down to the stable yard, a number of areas really suffering from, for example, the southern range of the stable yard, which has been almost completely destroyed by fire. There's no roof structure, there's no longer a first floor, and it's standing as a roofless ruin. So that's detrimentally impacted the significance there. So that understanding of significance allows us to understand which areas of the building have greater capacity for change. This block plan is just to give you an idea of the areas of the building which I'll discuss in a bit more detail over the next sort of 15 minutes. So we've got the Wyatt wing, the 1717 core, the service yard, the office wing, and the stable yard. This is a developed concept plan of the whole proposals. And as I said, I'll move through each area of the building one by one, starting with the Lewis Wyatt wing. Just to say something very quickly about the first floor plan. So this is a developed concept plan of the whole building, and the strategy for providing bathrooms at first floor is that we are creating bedroom suites. So we're using existing partitions and existing spaces to create suites of rooms. And this is a different approach to what you might see with a hospitality scheme or a hotel scheme, where they would place typically a sort of bathroom pod in the corner of a room, which would then spoil the proportions and has a detrimental impact on the fabric of the building. But in this case, we're deliberately not going along that route. We are joining existing rooms together to create suites and placing wherever possible bathrooms in the location of existing bathrooms. Just to quickly say something about the general uses across the building. So it is a private house for Colin. The living accommodation is within the western part of the building, so the Lewis Wyatt wing and 1717 house. There are also leisure facilities associated with Colin's use, and then into the office wing and stable yard, we've got a series of guest cottage accommodation. So this is for visiting family members and friends, which has access to the leisure facilities. And then we have a number of staff cottages within the stable yard. As any country house of the 21st century will obviously require some staff accommodation. As we've seen from Tom Stuart-Smith's presentation, the landscape, for example, is going to require 2 or 3 full-time gardeners, and the intention is that they're housed on site. So the Lewis Wyatt wing, the intention within this space, as I said, this is part of the building with the highest heritage significance due to the intact quality of the interiors and many of the fixtures and fittings designed by Lewis Wyatt. And the proposals in this part of the building are really to do a sort of conventional restoration and representation of those spaces, and to reutilize the spaces as they were originally intended by Lewis Wyatt. So the dining room will become a dining room again. The library will become a library again. So in those spaces, it's really the removal of inappropriate light fittings, modern floor finishes to reveal the original historic boards, the reinstatement of a couple of missing fireplaces. There's a missing fireplace within the hall, and there's a missing fireplace in the staircase, for example. The images to the right of this slide give a bit of a sense of the look and feel for this part of the house. So it's a more formal part of the house for Colin and Gareth to entertain guests in this part of the house. and it's really presented almost like a country house restoration in that part of the building. To move on to the 1717 house, this part of the building has suffered, as I said, from numerous alterations, both by Lewis Wyatt and then later in its institutional use. So what we've found through the historical research that Becky has done is that, you know, this is actually an interesting house, but it has been so heavily altered in the past. And what we'd like to do is to return some of the quality of the spaces originally within this part of the building. So for example, the central doorway within the central bay of the 7-bay classical house was moved at a later date. So we'd like to reinstate the central entrance within this part of the house, and that this then aligns with an axis taken through Tom Stuart-Smith's beautiful garden proposals. So you would get this fantastic view through the house and out through the gardens. And it's to reinstate a stone flagged hall, which we know existed in this part of the building. It's referred to by Lewis Wyatt in his correspondence, and to reveal some of the original floor plan of this part of the building. The other things to note are the creation of a kitchen living space within the heart of this part of the building. This is in the location of the original servants' hall. So it's the removal of a couple of later partitions in that area. And this is really to create a heart for the house. This will most likely be the door that's used on a day-to-day basis by Colin and Gareth, and this family living and kitchen space really then becomes the place where they spend most of their time. The other thing to note is the introduction of a conservatory orangery on the southern side, and this is both as a means to extend that living space within the heart of the home, and also to create a proper link with Tom Stuart-Smith's new garden spaces. It also provides the opportunity to resolve one of the historical problems with many country houses. So like many country houses, Cuerden suffers from the fact that the kitchen is so far away from the dining room. This was back when people had many domestic staff and there was a fear about fire spreading from kitchen spaces. So the dining room and the current kitchen space are at opposite ends of Cuerden Hall, which clearly does not mean that the dining room is viable in its function. So the proposal is to create a proper catering kitchen in this part of the building, which communicates between both parts of the house, and so that Colin and Gareth can hold a dinner party with friends, for example, in the formal dining room, but it can also serve the centre of the house. And these images really just give a bit of a look and feel for what these spaces might look like. So a stone flagged hall and reinstatement of the central entrance to the 1717 house, and an idea of what that kitchen family living space could look like. Now, the introduction of the conservatory is actually in the location of a conservatory which was proposed by Lewis Wyatt, and we are lucky enough to have the drawings which Lewis Wyatt prepared for this conservatory. And there are a few slight alterations to note. So he actually pulled the conservatory much further out into the southern gardens, and this was to create a light well behind. And that really interesting, actually. It was about getting light into the butler's bedroom, but also into the servants' hall, and also creating a screen. So from the publicly accessible gardens, you wouldn't be able to see into the butler's bedroom. The issue with Lewis Wyatt's design was that it created some very awkward geometry around this octagonal dairy, and which he, seemed to struggle with there too. So our proposal is actually to push that back against the building in the location of the later portico, which has mostly been demolished apart from the central bay. We can be quite sure of what Lewis Wyatt was proposing because we have these drawings. So we've got this elevation bottom left showing what he intended that conservatory to look like. And bottom right, we can see, top right, you can see a proposal for an even larger orangery conservatory on the other side of the ornamental dairy. So obviously, Lewis Wyatt was sort of struggling with the geometries in that location and wanted something a bit bigger. He also went to, the other thing to say is that there's an orangery by Lewis Wyatt still standing at Tatton Park in Cheshire. So this image bottom right, we put in there so we can be very sure of what that looks like. This image is to show our proposal for a reinstatement of a conservatory orangery on this site. And this has been developed through an iterative design process involving Historic England and the Georgian Group. And through that process, it was felt that it shouldn't be a direct copy of Lewis Wyatt's intended conservatory, that it should actually read as a new intervention, but that it should be in appropriate materials. So this is a sandstone conservatory orangery with timber doors and fan lights, timber glazed doors and fan lights. And it's set out using principles of proportion that were used at the time, but it is not a copy of the Lewis Wyatt orangery, so that future generations of historians are not going to be confused by an interpretation of the historical development of the house. Moving quickly on to the service wing. So the proposals here, as I mentioned, are to provide leisure facilities for the private use of the owners of the house. And this really seemed like the best place to put those leisure facilities on the site, because there are significant views of Cuerden Hall from the driveway looking towards the main house, from the parkland looking back towards the house, and from the southern gardens of Tom Stuart-Smith's design. So it was felt that placing a new pool structure within this courtyard would mean that it would be not visible from those principal facades. And it also is an area which has suffered from detrimental interventions in the past. So there's a later poor quality kitchen extension in part of that courtyard. And it also provides an opportunity to address some structural issues with some of the courtyard walls, which are bowing out. As I said before, the courtyard wall was added later, and it seems that it hasn't been very well tied back to the fabric. So those are the proposals, and these images give a bit of a sense again for what those spaces might be like. We're looking at the idea of a Victorian glass house or a palm court structure there. So it's principally a metal frame to the building and highly glazed, so that when you're within that space, you can still read that you're within a former courtyard. And again, this has been through an iterative design process involving Historic England and the Georgian Group. So really ranging from quite low scale single story up to a very elaborate 2.5 story. And through that process, we've really sort of pared it back. So this is an image of the proposed pool structure within the space. And in discussion with Historic England, we've talked about the massing of this building to create a stone screen wall at ground floor level, and to push back the glazed elevation and glazed roof lantern, both as a means to bring extra light into the courtyard, and also to make the building a bit more recessive. And very quickly to say something about the stable yard. The stable yard, as I said, the intention is to use this for accommodating staff accommodation. And these buildings divide naturally vertically. They currently have structural vertical walls, and they have structural chimney stacks vertically running through the building. They also have numerous doorway openings at ground floor, which were obviously for the horses into the stables. As you can see in this image at the top, some of those doorways have actually been blocked up, and you can see with some poor quality brickwork infills below a number of the smaller windows at ground floor. The intention is to reopen those so that you can actually read the rhythm of the original horse stabling, and then to create additional staff accommodation in the redundant hayloft spaces above. Then to the southern range of the stable yard, this is the range of the building which has been destroyed by fire. So it is actually a roofless ruin, standing ruin currently, missing the first floor and the roof structure. And here the intention is to replace, reinstate that roof, the first floor and the roof structure, and to put accommodation above, again for staff. So there'd be a number of staff apartments on the first floor. And on the ground floor, this is to create a space for garden stores, workshops, a machinery store for small tractors that are used for mowing the grass in the grounds. And it's important just to say that Cuerden suffers, again, like many country houses, where the estate has been split up and sold off. Many of its ancillary accommodation, so the walled gardens and all of the gardeners' accommodation, now sits outside of the estate in commercial use over towards the Cuerden Valley Park. So these spaces are really critical for the function of a 21st century country house, and for a landscape as intricate and complex as Tom Stuart-Smith's. Then finally, just to end on the proposed lodges at the end of the drive to Cuerden Hall. This is at the junction of Shady Lane and the drive to Cuerden Hall. As you will no doubt know, Cuerden originally had a number of lodges, one of which remains the Stag Lodge on the other side of the M65 and M6, but currently, completely severed from the estate now, and pretty much invisible behind some tall, mature planting there. But there was also a lodge at this junction, at the end of the drive with the Wigan Road, and we have all the drawings for those lodges proposed by Lewis Wyatt. There was also a very monumental lodge and sort of triumphal arch at the end of Berkeley Drive, which no longer exists. So this proposal is really about reinstating some of the experience of arrival at Cuerden Hall. Originally, you would have arrived at Stag Lodge, you would have travelled across the parkland on the original carriage drive, seeing the house from a distance and arriving through this great sort of picturesque sequence. But currently, the house lacks that sense of arrival and that experience. And we do believe that has a detrimental impact on the significance of the building. So the intention is to replace a set of gate lodges more or less on the location of the existing modern gate piers, which are in this location. And again, this has been developed in discussion with Historic England, where we have been through an iterative design process. And it was felt that these lodges should not match exactly the Lewis Wyatt proposals, but that they should be in the spirit of Regency lodges. So In the top right here, this is an image of a pair of gate lodges at Heveningham Hall in Suffolk, I believe, of the Regency period, and it's a new interpretation of Lewis Wyatt's original design, but using design cues from Cuerden Hall itself. So the use of the brick, the use of the mortar, the pointing, the bond, all refers back to the hall, along with the paired gate piers, which reference the corner turrets of the Lewis Wyatt wing. So that brings me to the end of the architecture. I think I've gone a little over. I think I've gone over by about 6 or 7 minutes. So I'll just pass back to Tom Flanagan now to take questions.
Thanks very much, the design team, Rebecca, Tom, both Toms. I hope everyone found that fascinating in terms of the history of the complex of buildings, and hopefully everyone appreciates what we're trying to do here, and that is provide a sensitive restoration to Cuerden Hall and the grounds. If I just pick up on some of the questions then that have been raised, I mean, there's been a couple of questions actually about the proposed use and rumours about a potential spa facility, spa resort. I'd just like to make it clear that this is a conversion to a family home. There will be some ancillary staff and guest accommodation, but it's primarily a single family home. You'll probably be aware that in the past there's been proposals for hotels and apartments, and it's quite refreshing to see what's being proposed here, and it's returning the hall back to its original use. Yeah, the most sensitive use for the building. If I just go down the questions. There have been a few questions about access as well, but that is more a legal aspect of this. It's not really a planning related matter. Equally, water supply for local houses. I'm not too sure what that's asking, but we have got a drainage strategy that's going to be submitted with this application, which will confirm that the drainage for the proposals is acceptable. There's mention here of light pollution. Again, on the basis that we're returning this hall back into a single residence, if anything, the scheme is going to reduce light pollution to the site and the surroundings. We are going to be submitting lighting proposals as part of the landscaping scheme, whether that's as part of the application or it will certainly be conditioned as part of a consent. But yeah, I would reiterate that we're going to have less impact in terms of lighting pollution. There's a question here directed to Tom Stuart-Smith, although it might be Max that answers this. So we've had a question about the cinder path in Lady de Houghton's plantations and whether this will be reinstated and the architecture on the ends of the tunnel kept. I don't know whether that's one you can answer, Max.
Yeah, of course. So my name is Max. I work for Tom Stuart-Smith. For those of you who don't know, there's a sunken path that runs along the north-south axis of the whole site, and that runs underneath the existing driveway. That has been condemned as structurally unsafe by structural engineers. So we are proposing to remove the crown of the bridge as it exists now and infill it with crushed material so that it's safe for vehicular traffic. So just by cutting off the top, we're leaving it as it is, so it could be restored potentially down the line at a later date.
That's great, thanks Max. We've had a question about local wildlife at Cuerden. Again, from the outset of this project, as well as the heritage significance of the building, the biodiversity on the site was seen as key. So that was one of the first reports that was commissioned. There is evidence of bats at the site, but there is no evidence of any other protected species. We've had a biodiversity survey that's been completed, and yes, that identifies the bats, and there will be appropriate mitigation put in place. But I would emphasise that with all the landscaping that's going in place of the tarmac that currently exists, there's a lot of potential for biodiversity enhancement. So that will become clear through the application submission. But if anything, this scheme is going to have a major benefit on biodiversity. Yeah, other questions have been raised about the use of the hall. Again, I'd reiterate, it's single family home. Probably a question for yourself again, Max, on the landscape proposals. It talks about, someone's raised the question about ignoring the setting within the Valley Park that surrounds it and the flora and fauna within it. I don't know whether that's something you'd like to just respond to.
I mean, I can probably respond to that. I mean, I think one thing that's interesting is people always assume perhaps that biodiversity is only served by a natural kind of landscape. In fact, you know, current research shows that a gardened landscape is often the most biodiverse of all habitats. For instance, the recent survey at Great Dixter showed that even though the garden is surrounded by special sites of special scientific interest, the most biodiverse part of the whole landscape is the maintained garden area. So I think that by actually creating a garden with quite a bit of sort of disturbance by people gardening, one does create a much more biodiverse area than would be the case if it was turned back to pasture with trees. And I think that the views out to the park will be maintained very much as they are at the moment, actually will be enhanced, because we're going to be removing some of the large seedling trees that have grown up around the house. And the view, the main view into the park, which is I suppose the east front, you could say, is something we don't have a lot of control over anyway, because the park starts about 15 meters from the front of the house, and that view is retained and will remain as being absolutely quintessential to the setting of the house.
That's really useful. Thanks for that response, Tom. There was an early question about an application being submitted and the process for that. We are actually targeting the end of this month for submitting an application. And following the submission and following validation of that application, all residents neighbouring the site will be consulted by Chorley Council, and you'll have another opportunity to view the proposals and submit any comments. There's been a question raised about impacts and disruption that might be caused by construction traffic. Again, I think because these proposals are for a single house with guest and staff accommodation, the proposals are pretty limited, and the level of traffic in that respect will be limited also. But I would emphasise that as part of any application, there will be conditions applied in relation to working hours, ensuring that any contractor is part of the considerate contractors scheme, and that they liaise directly with local residents. And there'll be a construction management plan as well that will have to be produced and adhered to by the contractor. So there'll be numerous conditions attached to the permission which will minimise any disruption to local residents. Yeah, there's another question again about the accommodation. There will be staff accommodation to look after this complex of buildings. As anyone can imagine, it's a huge site, a huge building. There is going to be staff that's going to be required to upkeep the building and look after the family that live there. Yes, it's a single house, which will have minimal impact on the surroundings. Yeah, one of the points actually that's been mentioned about disruption is disruption to the local road network. Again, because of the use that we're proposing, there's actually going to be less traffic generation than the lawful use of the site at the moment as a care home. So yeah, traffic associated with the future use of the building is going to be greatly reduced. Construction traffic will be reduced because of the scale of the proposals that are being proposed. Tom Brigden, there's a question that's been raised about plans for the part of the house facing the park and whether you could go through that again.
Yeah, can I go back in the, Max, could you put on the slide of the Lewis Wyatt wing, the plan? Yeah. Yeah, that one.
Okay, Tom.
Yeah. So this is a plan of the part of the house which faces the park. So the park is off to the left of the slide, with this bay window which looks directly out across the park. The proposal in this part of the house is to do very little, because it has the best interiors and the most intact interiors by Lewis Wyatt within the building. So it's really removal of anything which is detrimental to the fabric of this part of the house. As Becky mentioned, the dining room during the building's use as a care home had a sink and worktop fitted within the recess, which originally had a beautiful sideboard designed by Lewis Wyatt. And, you know, we'd love to put that beautiful sideboard back. Within the rest of these spaces on the ground floor, it's just the removal of modern sort of vinyl flooring, which has been laid on top of historic timber flooring. The removal of modern light fittings and things like electric wall heaters and things which have been added over time. There will be a programme of conservation works externally to the building. So that will be repointing of areas which need it. That will be works to some of the sash windows. The works to the sash windows will be refurbishment of the sash windows, so upgrading seals and joinery conservation works wherever the sills are rotten and things like that. The major alteration is in the bottom left corner in the study here, and that is the removal of a series of toilets which were added during the building's municipal use or potentially during its care home phase. So that's modern toilet partitions and fixtures and fittings, and the addition of 2 new windows within the wall overlooking the park. And those 2 new windows will be designed to match the existing windows facing the driveway in terms of materials and detailing. So I think you'll notice very little change externally to this part of the building facing the park. The only things that you might notice are the removal of a few extra services and redundant services which have been placed on the outside of the building. So redundant electrical fittings and redundant soil pipes and things like that. Otherwise, you won't really notice any change externally. There's also some conservation works proposed to the railings and gates. The gates are separately listed. So that's covered within this work, and that's proper, you know, conservation and repair of those elements. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's really useful. Thanks for that, Tom. We've also been asked a question, Max, about the restoration of the rest of the park, which is being overseen by Chris Burnett Associates, which is Heritage Lottery Fund supported the work about 15 years ago. So it's just, are we aware of that, and has that helped inform your landscape proposals?
Well, as Tom mentioned, that some of the main viewpoints throughout the garden look onto the Cuerden Valley Park, so they're all very important. The design from within the garden, but also from the Valley Park looking back in. In terms of management, we're going to be improving the surrounding woodland around the building, to the north and to the west of the site. So hopefully it's just keeping up that standard that's already there and improving it.
Right. Okay. Cheers for that, Max. There's a question here about looking to employ local people who may not need accommodation. I'm assuming that's for the future maintenance of the complex and the grounds. I don't know whether that might be one for you, Colin, in terms of staff for the facility in the complex.
Yeah, I think the expectation is 10 to 12 on-site full-time staff, half in the garden, half in the house. So the allocation really is about getting the right people. If they're local and they don't need accommodation, great. If they're not and they do, then we can offer that. So it's a quality question, really.
Great, thank you for that, Colin. There's a question here about poor internet access in the area and plans to improve access for the property. That's not really a planning requirement at this stage. However, I expect Colin will want to look at improving that for the complex, but it's certainly not a planning requirement and not something we're looking at in detail at this stage. The focus is the building and the grounds and restoring them to their previous grandeur. Yeah, I'm just receiving some positive comments now on the presentation, which is really pleasing to hear. Just to reiterate in terms of next steps, we are looking to submit an application later this month. You will be consulted by Chorley Council, but we've also got the website and we've got the email address. So we're keen to continue this engagement through the process. So any more information you need on the proposals, please visit the website. Any questions, please send those to the email address I mentioned earlier. I think that probably wraps things up. We've probably got 5 minutes if anyone's got any final questions. There has been another question raised about the estate and the water supply. I don't think there's anyone here on the team that's probably qualified to answer that question, but we have got a detailed drainage assessment that is being prepared and will be submitted as part of the application. So that will deal with aspects of water supply and drainage from the site. Right, I think that seems to be the end of the questions coming through. So thanks for all your positive comments as well. Very much appreciated, and I'm pleased that people are impressed with the proposals. I think we can probably wrap up this presentation now, and thank you again for your time this evening. Much appreciated.